Good morning in Brazil, good afternoon in UK, and ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Kelli Rudolph. Dr. Kelli Rudolph studied classics at Princeton, where she received her BA in 2002, and at Cambridge, where she was awarded a Master in Philosophy in 2003. After a year at Columbia University, she returned to Cambridge, where she completed a PhD on ancient atomism in 2009. No, not ancient Stoicism, not yet, not yet. Before joining the Classical and Archaeological Studies departments at the University of Kent, Kelli was an assistant professor at Grand Valley State University and held a postdoctoral research fellowship at Oxford University. Dear Kelli, thanks for coming. I will now hand it over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Aldo. Thank you all very much for the invitation. It's fantastic to be with you here today. Even though sadly we're not all together in person, it's fantastic that the technology allows us nonetheless to continue the life of the mind. So it's a real pleasure and a delight to see you all today. What I'm going to be talking about today is Epictetus. So although my specialism is ancient atomism, I have been making the move towards Stoicism in the last few years. I'm interested in fragmentary texts, fragmentary philosophical texts. And so it's been a real delight to work on Epictetus, which provides me with more words than what I'm used to normally looking at, which is great. But today what I want to talk about is Epictetus and the notion of the Theorema. And so theorema is something that we often translate as principle or rule or philosophical proposition, depending on the translation that you look at. But the concept itself of theorema hasn't been fully understood, despite its pivotal role in Epictetus's philosophy in particular, and Stoicism more generally. Now, Anthony Long, when commenting on Discourse 211, observed that Epictetus's essential point is that everyone is innately equipped with a shared stock of general concepts that furnish the basic capacity for making objective discriminations between good and bad. But, he said, they tend to think that they know the specifics of goodness and happiness and can therefore make correct value judgments in particular cases, when, in fact, they don't. So what is the status of these shared stock of general concepts? That's the big question that I'm going to be asking today, and that's where my focus is going to lie. The topic has gone more or less unexamined by contemporary scholars, and so what I want to examine is the meaning and the scope and the function of the Theoremata in Epictetus. So I want to look at how the interconnected processes of demonstration and articulation and confirmation build upon a theorema and then clarify its purpose. And finally, I want to look at what if we have enough time today, Aldo, stop me if I go on too long, what we call the ontological theorema, namely that distinction between what is up to us, the ephemein, and what is not up to us, the ukephemein, which is so familiar for Stoicism. So the ontological theorema is essential, and that's why I want to start there, because it fits together the preconceptions and particular realities in a special way for the Stoics. And what will become clear is that the Theoremata are not merely rules or principles, this is my hypothesis, but instead are conceptual tools that are aimed at developing virtues, which are themselves a form of science for the Stoics. Now, the results of this analysis, I think, have broad implications for our understanding not only of Epictetus's philosophical project, but the concept of theorema in ancient Stoicism more generally. So just to start with some observations about theorema itself. So theorema occurs 26 times in Epictetus's corpus and 6 times in a quick search of the index of the Stoicorum Veterum Fragmenta, which suggests that this concept is of some import for Stoicism in general, not only for Epictetus. So the term theorema is most prevalent in the Stoic analysis of the unity of virtues, that the concept of the unity of virtues, of course, going back at least to Plato's depiction of Socrates and the Protagoras. And it was a widely accepted doctrine by the time we get to the Hellenistic period. Now, Zeno seems to have held that the virtues are inseparable, while also suggesting that they are distinct and different from one another. Aristo and Cleanthes asserted an inseparability of virtues that was reminiscent of what we find in the Academy, while Chrysippus defended that apparent contradiction in Zeno's position by referring explicitly to the Theoremata. And so that's the bit I'm interested in today. Now, according to Stobaeus, Chrysippus defends Zeno's definition by demonstrating how virtues have theoremata that are held in common. You can see that at Long and Sedley 61d. Now, he does this by first asserting that a primary virtue, as a science, is characterized by a special perspective that is particular to each virtue. And nevertheless, because all virtues also have their theoremata in common, they have what Chrysippus refers to in this passage as a secondary perspective on the areas of conduct governed by the other virtues. Now, the testimony that Diogenes Laertius provides corroborates this Stobaean report. He cites Chrysippus, Apollodorus, and Hecato when asserting that for the Stoics, virtues imply one another reciprocally, and whoever has one has them all because they have the common theoremata. Now, an anonymous reference in the Anecdota Graeca fills this position out in a little bit greater detail. Although the provenance of the passage is unclear, it reflects the Stoic doctrine that we've just seen. It says that virtue is expertise, and that all expertise is a composite made of theoremata jointly practiced together. And that reason is in accordance with the theoremata, while character is in accordance with that joint practice. So already we're seeing that there's some kind of link between theoremata, on the one hand, the kind of underlying principles, those kind of general concepts that get us going, and the actions that we perform, the practical outcomes that arise from those from the combination of the theoremata. So these passages make it clear that theoremata form the basis both of the intellectual reasoning and that ethical practice, since science and expertise have the theoremata in common. Now, it's clear that theoremata play a fundamental role in grounding ethical action and reasoning in early Stoicism. And that can also be seen in those later passages in Stobaeus, where the cardinal virtues as kinds of science and expertise aim at a life in conformity with nature and are, as he says, brought together from the theoremata. So with that kind of early Stoic background in mind, we have to ask what are the theoremata that underlie these fundamental components of Stoic epistemology and ethics? And in particular, what do we make of Epictetus's use of the theoremata? So now let's turn and have a look at Epictetus. Now I might just throw hold on just a second. I might just throw some text in the chat so that it kind of sits alongside of us, and we can look at it together in the discussion if need be. So the first passage I want to look at is Epictetus Discourses 4:8, 8 through 13. So let's see if I can toss that into the chat. Oh, some of it. All right, well, we'll start there. Let me get the rest. Sorry, Aldo, I should have had his hand out. I thought this would copy into the chat. Oh, I'm not used to such small amounts of text being able to go into the chat. Well, at least the Greek is done. All right. So there we go. You've got the passage in Epictetus in front of you. So I won't read it out, but I'll just summarize what he says here. So Epictetus in Discourse 4:8 is looking at the kind of the image of the philosopher, the presentation of the philosopher. And he says, when we see someone acting contrary to the profession of the philosopher, we don't take away his title. Instead, we kind of, people make fun of him and say, you know, oh, well, this is just the kind of person he is. Although with when we compare the philosopher with the carpenter or with the musician, who have these skills or these expertise, and we can talk about the kind of cause of their, what is the cause of their work? What is the expertise that sits behind? And we judge them on the basis of their work. He says that society doesn't tend to do that with the philosopher. And instead, we judge the philosopher from externals alone. And we act as if, we, the public, act as if the notion of the philosopher is a mixed up and disjointed thing. Whereas what we should be doing is asking, what is the material, the hule of the philosopher? And the interlocutor of Epictetus says, oh, well, isn't it wearing a cloak? And he says, no, it's reason. And he says, we have to also ask what the telos is, what the end is. And he says, the end is to have right reason, the orthon logon. And he says, and so what sort of thing is the theoremata of the philosopher? In a joking reply, his interlocutor says, is it not the sort of thing to do with how long a beard is or how long his hair happens to be? And then Epictetus cites Zeno and says that Zeno says that the theoremata of the philosopher are to know the elements of reason, what sort of thing each of them is and how they are joined to one another and what things follow from them. So Epictetus's interlocutor assumes that the theoremata provide the measure or the rule for incidental conventions like hair and beard length. And he conflates that general notion with the particular theoremata that govern or that underlie types of expertise. And what Epictetus is telling us when he cites this reference to Zeno is that philosophical theoremata teach us about the elements of reason. But the stoicheia is never used in relation to reason in this particular way, outside of, in the way that it is here for Zeno, outside of this one example. Now, Jonathan Barnes observes that this passage is a notoriously puzzling text, and he doesn't commit himself to any interpretation of it. Mansfeld informs us that von Arnim includes it among Zeno's logical fragments, but Arnim does not try to interpret the meaning of the expression either. Tony Long first renders it as the elements of discourse, noting that it is unlikely to be an exact citation of Zeno, although he changes his view later when he publishes an article with David Sedley. Now, Sedley and Long and Sedley, when they are following, when they are translating this idea as reason, they follow Old Father, and they explained that it can't mean here something like parts of speech or parts of discourse, because the elements of logos, the elements of reason, are concepts and preconceptions, as we see in the reports of Aetius and Galen. And in fact, we find that the reports that the Stoics define reason as an aggregate, as an athroisma of comprehensions, of catalepsis. And Galen attributes to Chrysippus the view that reason is an aggregate of notions and pre-notions. So as we'll see a little bit later, the theoremata are not about the parts of language here. That's not the concern. But instead, it's about the way that preconceptions and concepts and particular realities are actually articulated. And Mansfield gets close to this when he says that even though Theoremata and the elements of reason don't have the same extension, that all elements of this type are theorems or can be converted into theorems, is what he says. So from this, we can see that the expression, the elements of reason mentioned here, refers to the knowledge concerning preconceptions related to philosophical theoremata. But what are these theoremata about? Now, the context of discourses 4.8 suggests that this is intimately connected with keeping reason in the right state. And so to achieve this end, a certain practice must be allied with the study of philosophy in order to strengthen the capacity for choice. Now, in this respect, Epictetus is in agreement with those Stoics who consider philosophy itself as a system of theoremata. So in at least 3 other passages, after criticizing those who assert the uselessness of philosophy, Epictetus declares that the theoremata are, by contrast, useful, Christon, and in fact that they purify the capacity of choice, and they equip the capacity to deal with the fantasia. Now, by these means, he argues, one can keep the hegemonikon according to nature and can correct impulse as well as desire. Moreover, using theoremata also leads to, according to Epictetus, an elimination of fear and grief, passion and hindrance, while also helping the philosopher to achieve freedom, serenity, constancy, and peace of mind. It sounds like one of those advertisements that you see, like, get it now, as seen on TV. This can solve all your problems. So what we find is that it's the consequences of using theoremata that make it possible for the philosopher to keep her reason in the right state, as Epictetus explicitly specifies in this passage that I've put in the chat. And indeed, he goes so far as to assert that the use of theoremata is the first and most necessary topic in philosophy. And he says that in the Enchiridion. In the Enchiridion at 52, 1-2, Epictetus asserts that the use of theoremata is the foundational activity of philosophy. But he maintains that students and teachers alike fail to attend appropriately to the use. So it's the use in particular that he emphasizes and that he stresses students and even teachers have trouble with. Epictetus gives as an example the command, do not speak falsehoods, which is the use of a certain theorema. Now, Hadot has observed that the 3 topics mentioned in Enchiridion 52 are not the same as those we find in the discourses, since here they set out the relation between theory and philosophical practice. Now, the first topic concerns the practical use of theoremata. The second is focused on theory, and the third is focused on meta-theory. In other words, on the logical and epistemological tenets that underlie theory. So in this context, the command, do not speak falsehoods, is presented as an exemplar of the use of theoremata because it is the practical measure of a theorema whose demonstration doesn't come down to us in this particular passage. Now, a theorema has 2 distinct parts. So the first is a theoretical demonstration that's rooted in the logical and the epistemological tenets of Stoic meta-theory. And the second is the practical application. It is what arises from that meta-theory, from that theoretical basis. It's what we often call the criterion for action, the canon for action. Now, presumably, confronting the usual charge of the uselessness of philosophy, Epictetus here is trying to explain that such a view arises only when philosophy is misused, either by people who are captivated by the theoremata themselves, who therefore ignore their use, or by those who want to, as he says, chatter about the theoremata. And they do that chattering because they want to look good. They do it for self-display. Now, Epictetus makes clear that when he criticizes someone who studies philosophical topics, he does so only when this person does not intend to put the Theoremata into practice. So the practice of it, the use of the Theoremata, is really where the emphasis sits for Epictetus. It's not the study of Theoremata per se that he objects to, but rather it's their misuse or their non-use, since good use of the Theoremata supposes that they have been studied, that they have been accepted, and that they've been implemented in daily life. And Epictetus explores the treatment of the Theoremata in a very vivid digestive metaphor at Discourses 321. Whoops. So again, I'll try to put this in the chat. There we go. This is a little shorter, so it should cut across just fine. Nope. There we go. Okay. So I will read this. I will read this passage out. Oops, if I copied the wrong one. Shoot, sorry. This is the earlier passage from the Enchiridion. There it is. So he says this: those who have taken up undress Theoremata immediately wish to regurgitate them, just as those with diseased stomachs do with food. First digest the Theoremata rather than regurgitating them in this way. If you do not digest them, they become an emetic thing, a rotten and inedible thing. But after the Theoremata have imparted their nutrients, show us some change in your hegemonicon, as athletes show the effects of exercising and eating in their shoulders, or those who have learned their expertise by heart show the effects of their learning. So the extended metaphor, as I said, itself, I think, is quite striking. Just as food that is ingested must become a part of the individual, so too the Theoremata have to be assimilated by the hegemonicon. The digestive process is such that ingested food, when the stomach is healthy, naturally improves the body. And similarly, the Theoremata improve the rational part of the soul when the Theoremata are assimilated. But if they're not assimilated, then like food in a diseased stomach, rather than improving one's reason, they weaken it. So in conjunction with the above mentioned passage on the utility of the Theoremata, Epictetus here refers to undress Theoremata as those which the philosophy student knows in words only, but doesn't put into practice. So the analogy here isn't between the student who wrongly takes in the Theoremata, as a person might eat something that makes you sick, right? You eat something that is that you're not supposed to eat. But rather the point is that the student takes up the Theoremata, which is meant for her own improvement, but she mishandles them by merely speaking about them rather than seeking to apply them to her own circumstances. So two results arise from this misuse. The first one is that the student is made worse by her exhibitionism. As we've seen, the type of use is important to Epictetus. So it's not enough to study and then use the study that you've done as self-display. You have to put them to use in practical living. So those who would use their knowledge of the Theoremata for applause or for approbation, Epictetus is saying here, perverts them, makes Theoremata noxious to them in themselves, makes them a rotten thing. And so rather than being a source of intellectual nourishment, the Theoremata become a kind of agent for display and a mere agent for display. Now these Theoremata bring about no change, right, in the individual because they remain unassimilated by the hegemonicon. But second, the Theoremata lying unassimilated inside of the student in this analogy begins to undergo a change in their nature themselves, right? He says in this passage that's in the chat that they become an emetic thing, a rotten and inedible thing. And so there's a change that's wrought on the Theoremata themselves, where they turn from that first and most necessary part of philosophy to something that's no longer fit for purpose. And not only not fit for purpose, but that will, in the end, make the individual sick. So moreover, the Theoremata now corrupt rather than improve whoever misuses them. And that's quite a strong statement that Epictetus is making, I think, here with this analogy. Now, we don't get the other side. We don't get the contrast when a student uses a Theoremata well, but I think we can nonetheless extrapolate from the example we have here. So I think we're supposed to think that when the student puts the Theoremata to good use and assimilates them by means of her hegemonicon, that then, like the athlete and the expert, she will begin to exhibit the effects of her learning. The comparison with the athlete and the expert, I think, are apposite here. In some circumstances, the student philosopher who makes good use of the Theoremata will manifestly exhibit them, just like an athlete's strength is visible in his shoulders or in his back or in the strength of his legs. Right? And in others, like the expert, the student who has learned the Theoremata by heart, the Greek there is analabontes, will result in the transformation of her hegemonicon, which might not be obvious at first glance, but which, when necessary, will be observed in her practice, in the way that she lives her life. So in that respect, the Theoremata can, according to this passage in Epictetus, can have a twofold manifestation, both in terms of external demonstrations, like the athletes, and in terms of internal states, like that of the expert. So for Epictetus, then, the study of philosophy begins with learning the Theoremata, which must be put to right use by the student, not for exhibitionist purposes, but for self-improvement and for moral progress. And when a student has learned by heart and has assimilated and has put the Theoremata into practice, the result is a positive transformation of the hegemonicon. Now, we've already mentioned that this kind of transformation. So the Theoremata are useful, they're Christon, because they purify the capacity of choice and they equip the capacity for dealing with the fantasiae. But one question remains. It is entirely understandable that we have to use Theoremata for all of these reasons. But why does a Theorema become an emetic, rotten, and inedible thing if it isn't used properly? Why is it likened in that respect? I think that's the kind of interesting question that arises from what we find here in Epictetus. Why doesn't this unused, or this Theoremata that sits inside of us, the way this kind of undigested food sits inside of us, why doesn't it, when it's not used, just become a neutral thing, an unused thing, like a tool that you forget, that you have in your garage? I think that the reason for that might be clear to us when we look at a passage from Aulus Gellius. So Epictetus is more explicit about the corruption of philosophy in this passage from Aulus Gellius 1719. So let's see if I can put this in the chat. Getting better at cutting the right piece, the right chunk size. Okay, so this is the passage from Aulus Gellius. And again, this is Attic Nights 1719. So I'll just leave it there in the chat. I won't read it out, just in the interest of time, so that we have enough time for a conversation at the end. But I think that what this passage shows us is that in addition, to practicing Theoremata, Epictetus presupposes that there are some qualities of the soul. He says in this passage that the vessel must be clean in order to receive the Theoremata. Now, Foucault, in his first conference on Discourse and Truth, asserts that there's a difference between the modern conception about receiving or obtaining the truth and the ancient conception. Now, according to Foucault, the ancients maintain that before receiving the truth, some moral qualities are needed in the first place. So, for example, Foucault argues that for Descartes, the criterion is the distinction and the clearness of an idea. And once someone perceives an idea with such qualities, then she also greets the truth. And in Epictetus, we find something that seems to imply such qualities are necessary before the study of Theoremata. Since in this passage, according to Gellius and Favorinus, Epictetus was particularly discontent when noticing that a man lost to shame or misdirected energy and debased morals was making use of philosophy. Now, Hadot points out in What is Ancient Philosophy that for the ancients, the study and practice of philosophy implies a choice of life, or as Sharp puts it, a kind of existential choice or a commitment to a specific way of living one's entire life. In fact, Hadot asserts that according to the Stoic Epictetus, such people talk about the art of living like human beings instead of living like human beings themselves. And Seneca says that they turn true love of wisdom into a love of words. So with those sorts of notions in mind, it seems that in these two passages, Epictetus requires his students to choose the philosophical way of life before engaging in the study of philosophy. And if it is not done, then the student uses philosophy solely for the purpose of self-display. And the Theoremata themselves become tools and means, not for moral growth, but for moral destruction and dissipation. And this decision is further implied later in the discourses, where Epictetus makes clear at Discourses 1-3, that we have to acknowledge that what he considers the truth about our origin and our value is that we have to have some kind of modesty. So he says that those who acknowledge their divine lineage, the fact that they have that bit of divine being inside of them, will simultaneously follow the path of modesty and at the same time make correct use of presentations. But whoever uses philosophy badly transforms it into a corrupting influence, and that person is said to be without shame and lacking in eidos. So I think we can conclude that the correct use of Theoremata implies decision-making concerning our own origin and our own value. And those who value themselves as daughters and sons of God will strive for modesty and will make good use of philosophy and the Theoremata. But those who do otherwise become shameless, or as Epictetus figuratively says, they become dirty vases in which philosophy and its Theoremata will degenerate, and not just degenerate into a neutral state, but worse, they will degenerate into something that is dangerous and poisonous. So that's just that still is, I think, one of the things I'm most interested in talking about. I look forward to hearing your insights on what you think about that particular piece. What do we do with the kind of negative depiction, the seriously negative depiction that we get here in Epictetus about the misuse of philosophy? So now that we have a kind of clearer sense of the meaning, the scope, and the function of Theoremata, we have to ask where they arise from, where they come from. So Epictetus provides us with some evidence about how a philosopher arrives at a theorema. Epictetus suggests that the three topics of philosophy, the use of theoremata, demonstrations, and the confirmation and articulation form part of a whole sort of program. So he tells us that confirmation and articulation, which concern logical and epistemological fundamentals, form the basis of the demonstrations, which in turn are necessary for putting theoremata to use. And at no point in his extant writings does Epictetus clearly articulate how the theoremata arise, although we're often given some examples of theoremata, like the one I gave you before, that we do not speak falsehoods. Now, in what follows, I'm going to try to kind of pull apart the pieces of text that we do have and put them back together in such a way that we're able to see where the theoremata come from for Epictetus. So for the Stoics, a demonstration, an apodeixis, is a valid form of inference from premises about self-evidently clear phenomena to conclusions about non-evident theoretical entities. So demonstrations bring to light hidden fundamental truths that experience by itself can't reveal. Now, precisely because the premises lead to non-evident theoretical conclusions, Epictetus specifies that a further confirmatory and explanatory component is necessary in order to establish the demonstration and, by extension, to establish the theoremata. Now, Simplicius, in his commentary, suggests that the third component is the logical method. Now, Epictetus does not spell out precisely how this kind of confirmation and articulation supports the theoremata, but the example, do not speak falsehoods, might help us to better understand his process of reasoning. So, Epictetus specifies that the theoremata are the first and most necessary part of philosophy, and at Discourses 2:11-13, he suggests that the beginning of philosophy, and indeed the very task of philosophy itself, includes the discovery of a canon, the discovery of a measure. And he analogizes such discovery with the beam of a scale or the carpenter's level for establishing, respectively, the parameters of what we judge as heavy and what we judge as straight. Furthermore, he asserts that there must also be a discoverable measure for those things which are most necessary for mankind. And he says that these are akin to the theoremata and arise from what is familiar and clear when we make use of what is distinctly articulated. Now, the language here of discovery is important, since Epictetus asserts that such criteria are taught by nature, or as he suggests elsewhere, given by God. Now, by grounding these criteria in nature or in the divine, I think Epictetus here is hoping to establish an unassailable foundation for philosophy and, by extension, for right action. Now, Epictetus spells out the process by which such discoveries are made by again drawing on the components of Stoic demonstration, combined with articulation and confirmation. So in concluding Discourse 2:11, Epictetus returns to the themes that we saw right at the beginning of the paper, highlighting the complementary components of philosophy. He writes this: "To philosophize is this, to examine and to confirm the criteria, and the act of the good and excellent person is to immediately use them once they have become known." I'll just put this bit of text in the chat as well. So from this, we see that the canones, like the theoremata, are discovered through the technical components of philosophy, through demonstration, through articulation, and confirmation. But that work is incomplete until it's acted upon. The acting upon it is the thing that kind of brings it to its telos, brings it to its completion. So we see that for each theorema, each theorema encompasses a criterion, and a demonstration. The criterion is a practical imperative that's derived directly from the conclusion of a certain demonstration, which by its turn, and strictly speaking, according to the Stoics, is a syllogistic argument, or a system of premises that lead to a conclusion. So when Epictetus talks about putting a theorema into practice, it is manifest in the application of a canon in the form of a command. That's why the example he gives us is do not speak falsehoods. So whoever puts a theorema into practice is simultaneously applying a criterion which she's derived from the conclusion of the theorema's demonstration. Now, exploring these passages together provides a roadmap to understanding the different ways that people go wrong when they begin to reason. So in Discourse 211, problems arise when the preconceptions of good and evil, or just and unjust, are fitted together incorrectly to the particular realities. And it's precisely because an individual fails to make use of the measures that these problems arise. Now, in the same way, those who study the Theoremata aren't free from error. As we've seen, Epictetus rebukes those who misuse the Theoremata, because for Epictetus, all theoretical activity in philosophy, and consequently the production of Theoremata, have to serve one end and one end only, namely, to act in accordance with right reason. And without this, as we've seen earlier in the paper, the Theoremata themselves are corrupted and they poison the mind. So in what follows, I want us to just explore how the correct use of Theoremata can overcome the errors. So we've seen that the Theoremata are the most necessary topic of philosophy by reason of their use, since it implies the correction and the improvement of the hegemonikon. But now I want to turn our attention to how these improvements take place when the Theoremata are used in conjunction with the articulation or the fitting together of preconceptions and particulars. So Epictetus begins in Discourse 217 with a discussion of the difficulties that face a student who first comes to philosophy. And he sets up a dichotomy between those things that the student thinks he knows and needs to get rid of in order to do philosophy, and those which the student does not know, but which philosophy imparts to him. Now, the first category is illustrated by normative claims about things that are good and evil, fair and foul, and what ought or ought not to be done, and the attendant judgments that come alongside them, like praise and blame. But the second category, we're told, are the Theoremata. Now, the difficulty that most people face in beginning philosophical studies, Epictetus tells us, is twofold. First, they believe that they will learn one thing. In the example that Epictetus gives, that they will learn how to be witty or how to gain profit. But the reality is, in fact, that philosophy teaches them the Theoremata. So that's the first. The second mistake is that they think that the category of things that they already know and the category of things that philosophy teaches overlap. Epictetus illustrates this mistake by criticizing Theopompus, who wrongly censures Plato for trying to define key moral terms, since Theopompus, the orator, thinks that we already have comprehension of them. Epictetus responds that such natural, or as he understands it, innate comprehension does not imply that we can correctly fit preconceptions to the corresponding realities. And the difficulty, he says, arises because we are not able to fit together the preconceptions to the corresponding realities unless we articulate the former and investigate how this reality must be subsumed to each one of the preconceptions. So this is Discourses 2:17-7. So I'll just put this in the chat with the Greek. So the fitting together of harmodzane, of preconceptions to realities, is an action that requires us first to articulate. The Greek here is diarthorosanta. and we have to articulate the preconceptions, and then we have to investigate what dependent relation holds between a particular reality and the preconception to which it belongs. This fitting together, Epictetus tells us here, is the demonstration. Now, the technical term epimeros ousiais, particular realities, it occurs 7 times in Epictetus's corpus. I am so sorry. I'm in a conference giving a paper, sorry. So the technical term epimeros ousiais occurs 7 times in Epictetus's corpus, and it occurs always in the context of preconceptions and the verb epharmazo in order to clarify the use of education or philosophy. In Discourses 2, 17, 11, Epictetus says, "What then is the articulation and the completion of a prolepsis? Show me that. How will I show you? Fit it together well to particular realities," he says. And again, at Discourses 1, 2, he says this, "For this above all we need education, to learn to fit the preconception of the rational and irrational to the particular realities in harmony with nature." Now, Hart translates the phrase particular realities, and George Long, particular cases. Old Father translates it individual instances, but I've chosen the translation particular realities, since the phrase sets out an ontological distinction between different realities or types of being. So, for example, at Discourse 4:1, Epictetus says, "Let him not seem to be a fool, but let him learn what each of the beings are, as Socrates said, and not purposelessly fit the preconceptions to the particular realities." So in order to fit the preconceptions together well, we need to know what each being is. And therefore, it is implied that every being can be rightly named and known when they've been correctly fitted together with the preconceptions. What's more, the mere fact that Epictetus uses the phrase tiesti tonon ton hekaston, citing Socrates to substantiate the fitting together of preconceptions to these particular realities, is enough to suggest that some kind of ontological distinction is at play here. So, Hadot and Hadot in Apprendre à philosopher dans l'Antiquité suggests that Epictetus's ontological bias in a related context when he writes this: "There are at the same time an ontology and an ethics hiding behind this apparently banal distinction between things that depend on us and things that do not depend on us." So once the process of articulating moral preconceptions with the concepts of existing things is finished, the act of fitting together the preconceptions with particular realities comes about quite easily. So for Epictetus, the fitting together is the most important ability for humans, since the causes of all human ills is the inability to fit correctly the preconceptions together with the particulars, with the realities that are in front of us. And he makes this clear in Discourses 4:1 when he says that whoever has false opinions will fare ill, while someone with right opinions will fare well. And therefore, the philosopher and the philosophy student who can purify their capacity of choice and rectify their capacity that deals with aphantasii by fitting preconceptions together with particular realities is in a good position. So to put it in the simplest terms, when we fit preconceptions together with particular realities, the philosopher and her student will have sound beliefs about existing things in the world and therefore be able to live life well. Now, we've already seen that Epictetus makes use of the notion of articulation. It showed up in the passage in the Enchiridion and in Discourse 2:11, which I've put into the chat. Now, the verb that is used here for articulation is diarthrosis, and that's the noun, the articulation, and it derives from diarthro, which has several associated meanings. It serves to generally mark out or differentiate elements of a body or of an argument. It can also be used to signal a conjunction of parts, and so is sometimes translated as well knit in old translations, as if someone has knitted together two bits of yarn. Now, Epictetus makes use of the senses of this term across his discourses, and he uses many of these senses depending on the context in which he's writing. So for him, this notion of diarthroo, this notion of something that is articulated or well knit, includes both the action of mentally manipulating preconceptions and concepts, so the kind of joining and separating of concepts and preconceptions as is appropriate, but also the act of verbally fitting together the names of preconceptions with the correct realities. And Epictetus asserts that the examination of the meaning of names is the very beginning of the investigation in philosophy, declaring that Antisthenes, Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus are supporters of this view. That's at Discourses 117. And in Discourse 217, he adds Plato into that mix. So the examination of names underpins the fitting together of preconceptions to particular realities, since preconceptions are, at the level of language, names of certain moral qualities: good and bad, fair and foul, just and unjust, and so on and so forth. So these remarks help us to understand that passage where Epictetus criticized Theopompus. So I'll just put this once more into the chat. So again, this is from Discourses 217. So he writes this, for in general, if we all speak the names not in an empty way, and if we know each one of these, and if we do not need to care about the articulation of the preconceptions, why do we disagree? Why do we fight? Why do we blame one another? Also, why now do I point to this mutual conflict and bring this thing to mind? If you yourself properly fit together your preconceptions, why are you disturbed? Why do you impede yourself? Now, in a series of negative statements in this passage, Epictetus makes clear that knowing and meaningfully using the names of preconceptions is not enough to eliminate conflict among people, or even within a single person, regardless of what Theopompus says. Rather, according to Epictetus, it's through the processes of articulation and the proper fitting together of the preconceptions to the realities that we begin to make progress. So for a vivid illustration of this, let's return a few lines earlier to Epictetus's example at 217.9. Here he highlighted how the articulation of a preconception like healthy is affected by the difficulty that lay people have in appropriately fitting the preconceptions of healthy and diseased to their corresponding parts. He juxtaposes healthy with its related medical concepts: abstinence, nourishing, bleeding, and applications of the cupping glass. And in this particular case, the hierarchy between those terms seems clear. The latter terms are subsumed under the preconception of healthy, right? So a healthy person is a person who's had these procedures performed. And this suggests that according to Epictetus, we have a natural comprehension of names like healthy and unhealthy, good and bad. So good and healthy are useful, just, advantageous, while bad and unhealthy are their opposites. And now furthermore, under each of these preconceptions, Epictetus suggests that we subsume certain concepts. In this example, the articulation of the preconception of health and its subordinate concepts is primarily constructed by means of an implied division between health and its contrary, disease. And that's followed by the process of division, or dihieresis, which is familiar from Stoic logic, in which a series of species of things is subsumed under particular headings. So we see that the process of conceptual articulation between preconceptions and concepts proceeds from the examination of names to a logical process of division, which in turn enables us to correctly fit the preconceptions to the particular realities in our daily lives. And it's only after this examination is complete that we can fit together the preconceptions to the particular realities in a way that is appropriate. So for Epictetus, the intermediate goal of teaching philosophy is to enable students to master their understanding, their articulation, and the fitting together of preconceptions. We've just explored how divisions play a role in bridging that gap between the articulation and the fitting together of preconceptions. And we've seen that for Epictetus, this process is also intimately connected with learning the Theoremata. But that still leaves a slight question, which is what the precise relationship is between Theoremata and the articulation and the fitting together of preconceptions. And that becomes a little bit clearer when we look at Discourse 3.9. So again, I'll put this in the chat. So this passage is Epictetus Discourse 3.9, and he writes this. When someone came to Epictetus, who was going up to Rome to do a legal suit regarding his authority, Epictetus asked the reason for his trip. And the man then asked what Epictetus thought about the matter, the legal suit that he was about to bring. And he said this: if you ask me what you will do in Rome, whether you will succeed or fail, I have no theorema about this. But if you ask how you will do, I can tell you this: if you have right opinions, you will do well. And if they are false, you will do badly. For to all men, the cause of their acting is some opinion. Now, in this passage, Epictetus illustrates the relation between Theoremata and the process of articulating and fitting together the preconceptions with the particulars. Now, the particular circumstance at hand is that of an elected provincial governor headed to Rome to defend himself in a legal suit. The preconceptions are the moral terms: good, bad, true, false. And the theorema is: if you have right opinions, you will do well. And if you have false opinions, you will do badly. Now, what Epictetus makes clear is that the theorema aids in fitting the moral preconceptions to the appropriate target. One cannot answer the question, what will I do, with such terms in this context, but instead has to focus on the other question, namely, how will I do? And this is because, as we saw above, Theoremata, when properly used, are conceptual tools that improve the hegemonicon by clarifying our decision-making, the prohieresis, and enhancing our perceptive capacity. So questions about good and bad are directed by this theorema to the governor's opinions, and whether those opinions are true or false, not to his actions. So Epictetus here reaffirms his commitment to what we've already seen, namely that actions proceed from the hegemonicon that is in right order. Epictetus articulates it in this way. He says, to what end do philosophers have theoremata? For this, whatever may occur, they have and arrange their hegemonicon in accordance with nature. So correct action arises out of having and maintaining a ruling faculty conformable to nature. So to sum all of this up, the Theoremata and their corresponding canones, their corresponding measures, are primarily concerned with the articulation and the fitting together of preconceptions, concepts, and particulars by means of the action of verbally fitting together the names of the preconceptions to the correct realities. So according to Epictetus, human beings know by nature the definitions of preconceptions, but the difficulty arises when they apply those preconceptions to the particular realities. And once the articulation through Theoremata is correctly applied, the hegemonicon of both the student and the philosopher is in accordance with nature. So with this in mind, let's turn now to that last little piece that I mentioned right at the beginning, what we are calling the Ontological Theorema, which is the most important theoremata of all, according to Epictetus. So if we think back to that example of the healthy and the unhealthy pair, and think about instead that Stoic trio, the good and the bad and the indifferent, we can expand our understanding of the articulation of moral preconceptions and of moral concepts. So we know from Arius Didymus and from Diogenes Laertius, among others, that under good, the Stoic subsumes the four cardinal virtues and everything which participates in them. Under bad, they subsume the vices corresponding to corresponding to those cardinal virtues and the things which participate in them. So by extension, under neither good nor bad, the Stoic subordinates all indifferent things and their species or their parts, so body, wealth, health, fame, and so on and so forth. But what prevents the Stoic from making the mistakes that Epictetus so often chastises his audience for committing, namely from subsuming the concepts of wealth and health under the preconception of good and the concepts of sickness and poverty under the preconceptions of bad. That's the real question. Like, what is it that keeps the philosopher from doing that? And the key for Epictetus is found in the famous distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us. Now, we've already explored the intimate connection between the natural or God-given criteria, the canones, discovered by philosophers, which are then formulated into theoremata that underpin right thinking and lead to right action. But Epictetus also marks out this distinction between things up to us and things not up to us as the most important in his philosophy, since the first and most important criterion that we possess for testing fantasia arise from that distinction between what is ephemine and what is uk ephemine. Now, Epictetus emphasizes the importance of this distinction at Discourse 326, where he talks about Odysseus as someone who trusts in nothing exterior to himself, but only to his interior qualities. So again, I'll put this passage from Discourse 3.6 into the chat. So the passage says this: what did he trust in? Not his reputation, not his wealth, nor his authority, but his prowess. This is his belief concerning what is up to us and what is not up to us. For these actions alone make humans free and unhindered, raise the head of those who've been suffering, and make them look with steady eyes on the rich and on the tyrants. And this was the gift given to the philosopher. So the rational principle that arises from the distinction is what we call the ontological theorema, because all things can be categorized on the basis of this ephemine distinction. Epictetus, remember, contrasted things that are up to us and things that are not up to us, which share a common characteristic, namely whether the action is ours or whether that action belongs to someone else. And he then proceeded by way of division to identify those conceptions which can be subsumed under each of those categories before bringing these contraries together with their related concepts. Epictetus explains how such a theorema is to be used when putting fantasia to the test, or strictly speaking, when testing an opinion relative to a certain preconception. Now, the preconceptions involved don't become clear until we start looking at what Epictetus has to say about the articulation of the preconceptions in relation to the particular realities, when he suggests that any fantasia not up to us should be relegated to the category of "it is nothing to me," or in other words, should be considered an indifferent. Now, this demonstration, along with its derived criterion, appears many times in Epictetus's discourses. So we see it at Discourse 130, when Epictetus asks his student, "In your school, what did you call exile and prison and chains and death and dishonor?" And the student replies, "I called them indifferent things." And again, in 122, where Epictetus is even more explicit, and he writes, "Choice and all actions dependent on choice are up to us. The body, the parts of the body, property, parents, brothers, children, country, and in short, all with whom we associate are not up to us. Where then shall we place the good? To what class of things shall we apply it? To that of things that are up to us." So yeah, there are examples throughout Epictetus that signal the same things. So it's through the use of the ontological theorema and its criterion, given by nature, but discovered by philosophers through demonstration, that the philosophy student is able to fit together the preconceptions of good and bad to the appropriate particular realities, and by extension is able to abstain from fitting together those preconceptions and names to the wrong particular realities. So importantly, the concept of ephemine and ukephemine are mutually exclusive. Only the former, the ephemine, are good or bad, while the latter are neither good nor bad. And in the case of things that are up to us, we have a disjunction of the preconceptions of good and bad, i.e. things that are up to us are either good or bad, while in the case of things not up to us, we have a conjunction of the negations of good or bad. For example, things not up to us are neither good nor bad. And we can formulate the measure presented in Enchiridion 1.5 in this way. So let me just put this in the chat. So 1, if something is not up to me, then it is neither good nor bad. And 2, if something is good or bad, then it is up to me. That's the logical consequence of 1. So these rules, the criterion of Enchiridion 1.5 and its logical consequence, must be understood. They have to be learned by heart and put into practice by the philosophy student. And as we've seen above, Epictetus applies this ontological theorema several times in the discourses and in the Enchiridion. And when he does this, he gives us usually an application of the theorema, he sort of points out that for each thing that we encounter, we have to ask these questions. We have to ask whether something is within or outside the sphere of choice. In other words, whether the thing is up to us or not, since some things are up to us in mental operations of our capacity for choice. But if something is outside of our sphere of choice, then he says we have to throw it away, that it is nothing to us, that it's neither good nor bad. So that's the ontological theorema, and that's the thing that he thinks is so fundamental to right action and to making sure that our choices are situated in the right way, that that we have our prohairesis acting in the right way. So as we've seen, this ontological theorema is the most important theorema in Epictetus's philosophy. And so it's no coincidence that it sits at the very beginning of the Enchiridion and at the very beginning of the Discourses, because it's through this theorema that the philosopher and her student can articulate properly the preconceptions of those of that Stoic trio: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. There should be a Hollywood movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Indifferent. But the redirection of the prohairesis associated with the correct application of the preconceptions to the proper particular realities, to those that are internal rather than external, makes the prohairesis strong in the sense that it acquires its peculiar moral virtues. And these arise from the application of moral preconceptions to the things that are properly in the realm of choice, i.e., the things that are up to us. So the result of this is that the prohairesis is unhindered and unobstructed. So for Epictetus, good and bad, both as names and as concepts, apply exclusively to what lies in the realm of prohairesis and can't be properly applied anywhere else. Additionally, Epictetus commits himself to the view that good and bad are certain qualities of prohairesis, and therefore that it is up to us to make prohairesis straight, or the. Consequently, to be good or bad is totally up to us. And in fact, at Discourse 1.8.16, Epictetus remarks that the correct application of preconceptions constitutes human beings' genuine good, and the true education is to learn how to do this. So by means of this division, the philosopher and the philosophy student can start to perceive themselves as the moral foundations of reality, as external things will be seen free from moral value as neither good nor bad, even though their use and their management will not be indifferent. And this is an important distinction. And Epictetus makes clear both in Discourse 2.5 and in Discourse 2.6 that external things will be the materials on which our prohairesis will work. And if this prohairesis is in a good state, it will make good use of the external things and keep itself unhindered and free. But if it's in a bad state, it will obstruct itself by making bad use of external things. So for Epictetus, the good uses of externals depends primarily on it, correctly naming them, not calling them, nor seeing them as good or bad things, but calling them and seeing them as indifferent materials for prohairesis. So if we return to the earlier Stoic notion of theorema that we started with at the very beginning of our time together today, we can see that Epictetus's view clearly arises from a tradition that goes back to the earliest Stoics, for whom the cardinal virtues are types of knowledge and expertise in some matters, for whom the Theoremata comprise those cardinal virtues, and which are knowledge aimed at practice, and whose goal is to live consistently with nature. So for the early Stoics, the elimination of passions and the achievement of eudaimonia can only be had by means of these cardinal virtues. And although Epictetus never explicitly asserts that the cardinal virtues are types of knowledge and expertise, or that the cardinal virtues are comprised from the Theoremata, these are a set of assumptions that he shares with those early Stoics. And as such, we can conclude that Epictetus assumes that the cardinal virtues, as types of knowledge and expertise, arise from Theoremata. Accordingly, Epictetus makes Theoremata that first and most necessary topic of philosophy. And like his predecessors, Epictetus also holds the Theoremata to be knowledge aimed at practice, purifying and equipping the capacity of choice in order to keep the hegemonikon in accordance with nature. As such, the Theoremata ultimately lead to the elimination of passions and consequently to ataraxia and eudaimonia. So in our final analysis, we can say that for the Stoics in general, and for Epictetus in particular, Theoremata are conceptual tools that have to be taken up by students of philosophy in order to achieve the virtues and everything that emanates from those virtues. What's more, for Epictetus, it's the ontological theorema that is most important, because knowing what's up to us and what is not is the only way that we will be able to ensure freedom. So a comprehensive mapping of Epictetus's other theoremata is the natural next step in developing a clear view of the structure of Epictetus's philosophy. But I don't have time for that today. But what has become clear is that for Epictetus, the theoremata are essential features of the conceptual toolbox of a philosophical education. And this philosophical education is aimed to awake and to develop the virtue in ourselves and in our students, and consequently, to give us all the opportunity to become fulfilled human beings. So thank you all very much for listening to that. I can't wait for the discussion. Thanks very much, Aldo.
Oh, hi, Kelly. Oh, I'm very happy. I was remembering the first time we talked about it in 2015, and I met her, and she invited me to prepare my speech in a seminar she was organizing, and she looked at my text and asked, "What did exactly theorema means in Epictetus?" And I said, I don't know. In fact, nobody did this question before. So you have been working on this subject for so many years, and it sounds so beautiful when you talk about it.
Finally, it sounds beautiful.
I think, I don't know, what do you think it can be published now?
I think we're really close, yeah. I'm such a perfectionist.
Yeah, I know, but
I'm like, no, it has to be perfect.
I learned with Kelly that this method is very difficult method, but also we learn a lot because we discover a lot of things. We look at the evidence and we analyze them slowly. It's a very slow method, but we discover many things. And I don't know. I don't remember anyone talking in this level about Epictetus. I don't remember. I think it's a good stuff, very hot stuff, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's slow, but it's aimed at the truth, right? Like the difference is you can go quickly over these texts and get a broad view, but it's in the depths that we find the reality. We find the truth of what of what sits in these thinkers. And also what drives our own work, right? I mean, going back through this paper in preparation for today, while at the same time preparing my philosophy module for next term, was like, reminding myself, what is it that we're doing here, right? So it's really nice to talk to another group of philosophers about this as we reflect on the meaning of the text itself, on Stoicism from antiquity, but also on what we're doing when we study for ourselves. And when we teach our students. I think, there's a lot to be had here. It always feels like a reprimand to read Epictetus as a philosophy teacher.
I always remember there is another passage that I received some weeks ago in Marcus Aurelius, where it says that his teacher of philosophy convinced him to not write about the Theoremata, and only to it's hot stuff. I said this to you.
Yes, please.
I was translating this passage, and I think it totally agrees with what we have said. It's something to be put in practice, not something to write about it, not something to display, to make a display about it. But let people make questions, please. Danilo, where are you? He helped a lot. He put all your messages in the chat on the YouTube. Yeah.
Sorry, I should have given you a text.
Mm-hmm. What is this sound? Your sound is not okay, Danilo. Your sound is not okay. You sounding like a robot or something. Try again. No, it's not him. Who is? I don't know.
It's his microphone.
Yeah?
Yes.
Joelson, do you have any question?
Oh, no questions. Congratulations for your presentation. Very good. Very good.
Thanks.
And Danilo?
Plug it in.
Yeah.
Danilo, try to plug your...
Plug out and plug in again your microphone. I think he's not using microphone. I don't know what's happening. Wow.
Oh dear.
Yeah. It's kind of robot or something. So
yes, now.
Oh no. Fantastic. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you thank you a lot, Kelly, for the presentation. I think I don't have any particular question because this work I had the opportunity to read. So thank you very much. And I think you could talk about the condition of the hegemonic. This is a thing I can't understand. I can't understand yet. What Epictetus means by the transformation of the hegemonicon, considering the pneuma doctrine. Because I am studying a little about the doctrine of the pneuma, and then this means the constitution of the hegemonicon with the communications of the tensions, and this will be of my interest because of the prosopre. But I would like to understand better what this means, the transformation of the state or the condition of the hegemonicon, and what this means for Euroia, for the communication with the flow of life. I believe there is a connection there. I don't know. I said a lot of things here. Is more sharing my doubts.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done on the condition of the hegemonicon, and in particular on how the kind of physics of it work, right? Like that's the piece that I think there needs to be a lot of work done on that, on like what the actual physics of it look like, and how those pieces fit together. And I think it's why, I mean, Aldo will know I keep like harping on about like why this metaphor, why this digestion metaphor, why is the transformation that happens inside the person poisonous? Like, why does that happen? And I just keep pushing on that because it sounds like that there's a transformation in the condition of the individual, right? That happens if these theoremata are allowed in. And so what kind of hegemonicon are we talking about here? What kind of soul are we talking about? Like the physics of it, that something could become so poisoned by a concept, right? And so I think that that sort of psychophysical connection, there's not enough work done on that. For me, that's a really important it's a really important question. I don't have an answer for you. Oh, thanks, Vilmar. I don't have an answer for you, but I agree. I think that's where an interesting question lies. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have an answer.
It's
What do
great.
you
Thank you very
think?
much.
What do you think?
I think that the concept has some physical aspect, as you mentioned, and there is some kind of transformation in the quality of the hegemonicon, considering the pneuma doctrine again. I think the key to understand the relation between the psyche and the soma, sensorial soma, is the pneuma. So I think there is some kind of digestion, as you said, and Epictetus mentions this a lot. I think it's some kind of physical transformation of the hegemonicon. I don't know.
Yeah, there's also that talk about sympatheia, right? So I think in 114 he talks about the soul being sympathanon, I think. This anyway, but there's a kind of sympathy that arises with the soul, a kind of fellow feeling or connected feeling, and maybe that's part of it too, right? That there's that it's about the way that the psyche is affected, because the thought has to be some kind of ordering or some kind of maybe balance or harmony that exists in the soul. And so we might want to think about the way that then the way that then becomes transformed on the basis of what you hold in your soul, or the kind of structures that you allow your soul to sit in or rest in, right? And yeah, so maybe something like that. Maybe it's something about the balance of motion, right? We get lots of talk about the movement in 114 too, when he talks about how there's the soul is this kind of piece of God in us. He talks about how how it's this kind of like fragment or bit, this portion of God in us, and that it knows the divine and is able to articulate divine movements. And so it may be something about the motions that the soul sets itself into. So maybe not the physical stuff itself, but the kind of the movement of the pneuma, right? And the way that the patterns of motion it finds itself in. And so maybe we might think about the way that the way that an individual undergoes transformation when they study philosophy is about the patterns that you set in place when you study philosophy, and the sort of the end that you put those patterns of motion to matter, right? So the way that you use philosophy, right? If you're using it for, to show off to your friends about like, ooh, look at me, I know logic, right? When you do that, like that, yes, okay, you know logic, but when that's your aim, like to show off your knowledge of logic, right? That's different from using it to live your life well and to make decisions in your life. And when you set yourself into a pattern of behaving in this way, which is just about showing off, versus in terms of living your life well and making the right decisions, right? That itself transforms you. So maybe if we think about it as patterns of movement here, that might help. I don't know. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting way, the question of the movement. But I think there's a lot of more things in there, because the movement, he has a environment. I don't know how to say this. He's in some he's in some object. The movement itself is something that has, I believe, I don't know, some kind of physical aspects. I don't know. Here I am saying a lot of things. Aldo, there is a question in the chat of Fernando. I can send the question here too.
Oh, good question. So for Epictetus, does physics underlie ethics? are Theoremata philosophical principles on the topic of physics? Oh, good question. So so the first question first. Does physics underlie ethics? I think it's connected, right? So yes, I mean, I should really leave it to the true experts on Stoicism in the room to say this. But yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes. These, the sort of areas of philosophy are all connected to one another for the Stoics, as they are for most ancient thinkers. I don't know, Aldo, do you want to come in on this? Marcus, Joelson, anyone else want to come in on this first question? Does physics underlie ethics? I think
for some reason I can't see this question, but anyhow, of
It's
course.
posted here, Aldo. It's posted here on the screen.
Oh, okay. Now, now I can see.
Here it is.
I think the objective of this cleaning of the soul, the objective of cleaning our soul from false opinions, is to harmonize the soul with the external, right? And to harmonize the internal nature with the external nature, right? As Chrysippus puts it, our nature is a part of the universal nature. And as Epictetus says, the only way to go against it is through our own opinions. That is, if we give assent to false opinions, then you resist to cosmos, right? And our soul will be against its own nature. You'll be you'll be in turmoil. You'll be in confusion, right? And I think something like this. So when you clean your soul from false opinions, you, in the physical level, you harmonize it. You put it in the in the tensility that it must has according to its nature. And doing this, it is at the same time with harmony with cosmos as a whole. I think it's something like this.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's why I was thinking about the movement of the soul, right? As we think about kind of harmony and what we mean by harmonization. As for the second question, I don't know. Does anyone else want to come in on that first question before I move to the second one?
Which is the first one? This one you were talking about?
About physics. Does physics underlie ethics?
Well, I don't know. I finally got some glimpse of the Theoremata. Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I remember I walked with you guys in the beginning of this research, and the first time you were so clear on your presentation, and the impression that I have is not it's just from your speech, is that probably there is nothing wrong think that physics underlie ethics, because what I saw from your presentation is that Epictetus is one more time in trying to put all the pieces together. Okay, you cannot separate things. You cannot separate physics from logic or from ethics. But if Theoremata is a principle, and you have to have this principle in order to practice. So if you have this kind of movement, you can see that physics can underlie ethics. But my point is when Epictetus is addressing this, what is he trying to fix, Kelly? He's trying to fix some issues with the Stoics, or he is addressing this to also the Plato's followers, the Peripatetics. So what is going on? What's going on? Why does he need to be so assertive on this subject and be so strong when he says that if you have the Theoremata and we don't practice, the philosophy does not make any sense. So the telos of philosophy is the practice. It is very Stoic. So and he's trying to fix that with the Stoics, with his own group, or he is trying to, open this dialogue to fix some issue with the others. What do you think?
Yeah, good question. So I think that, I mean, my assumption always was that he's lecturing to to a group of young students who quite like to go out after class and pretend to be philosophers with each other, right? Like, I mean, like our students do, right? I mean, maybe I'm reading too much of my own experience as a philosophy teacher into this, but when you see students take a philosophy class and then go, out with their friends or go into another literature module or whatever, right, into another class, and then start kind of throwing around these terms, start using concepts like sound and valid in ways that are neither sound nor valid, right? When they start using, the principle of non-contradiction in ways that, would make Aristotle roll over in his grave, you kind of think, my assumption was always that it was partly about directing his students in the right way, saying, don't think that just because you've started to learn a little bit of philosophy that you now are a philosopher. Like, don't think that this is enough to make you, to make you a philosopher, that you need to go beyond that. So that was partly, that's part of the assumption that I kind of brought to the text, perhaps, in thinking about why he's raising this. But I think that also it is a kind of, I think it is potentially also a kind of correction to, to Stoics maybe practicing in this period, right? When you think about, the kinds of people who are practicing philosophy and maybe some of the other philosophers working in this period, maybe it is really about a correction. What is it that we're really about here? What is it that we're really doing? As Stoics, as a school, what's our aim? It can't just be, it can't just be that kind of, the logical puzzles that we find in Chrysippus. It has to be more than that. It has to be the application. There's got to be, there's got to be the practical side of it. And that might even be a reflection of his time, right? I mean, he is working in a Roman context where, practicality is important, and the application of philosophy is, is certainly more at the forefront than what we saw in the classical period in Athens, or even, in Chrysippus, as I said. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think it could be a kind of internal strife that he's attempting to kind of draw a line under and say, come on, let's get back to what we're really meant to be doing here. I don't know, Aldo, what do you think? Or Marcus, what do you think?
Well, I think we can transport the discussion to nowadays. We're not finished that yet, right? We have the same issues today. We are dealing with what is Stoicism is about. We have the issue with the self-help. So and what kind of practice we are looking for? How can you make this philosophy important, not just for us, but just for society? Because when I see Epictetus discussing about that, I see also some issues. How can you make the philosophy available to the society? This is only the point I'm going back most of the time. We need to find a way, because the Theoremata by itself, it doesn't mean anything for Epictetus. It needs to have some kind of sense in the real practical life. But the point is, how can we get there? I don't see that clear, even from himself. I don't see, he is not clear for me. How can you do that on a daily basis? That's what I mean. But it is a very, very strong point, I guess. Very strong.
Aldo, did you want to come in?
Oh no, I do agree with you, and I remember that Jonathan Barnes says that his impression we have about the imperial period, the Stoicism in the imperial period, as totally focused on ethics, is false, actually, because we see Epictetus and Seneca, in reality, criticizing their age. In fact, we find many passages in ancient texts of this period where they picture a young man making display of his logical knowledge in banquets, in symposia, right? And the Romans loved logic for this, in this sense. And so we can understand that Epictetus is criticizing his age. And Seneca is doing the same thing, right? In fact, if you see the list of Stoic philosophers, many of them were only intellectuals, mathematicians, grammarians, and as Posidonius, for instance, as Crines, the logic, and many others. So the logical aspect was not underlined by all these Stoics. Only few of them dedicated themselves to develop this, right? And I think Barnes is right about it.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so I think for the second question, Danilo, that you've put up here, are Theoremata philosophical principles on the topic of physics? I mean, I think they could be, though they don't need to be, right? Because I think that the Theoremata are that kind of conceptual toolbox that we bring to we bring to the particular realities, and the point is to fit together. It's the Theoremata is the fitting together of the preconceptions that we have about the way the world works and the particular realities. So there's no reason why the fitting together of those two pieces couldn't be on the topic of physics. But I don't think it needs to be limited to physical principles.
I think someone have another question. I think we did it, right? Many thanks, Kelly, and for all, not only for this, but for all the support along these years. And this group we have now, you are immediately responsible for this. You are very, very important. You are a crucial part of it, right? It could not exist without you, in fact. I already told you, and I told the guys all the time about it. So many thanks.
Oh, it is such a pleasure, as ever, to see you all and to talk with you and work with you. I cannot wait until we can all go out for a beer together and sit and talk, or nice. On the beach and talk. I miss you all so much. It's really heartbreaking to only be able to see you on a screen and only in this kind of formal capacity. It's been really such a pleasure to share this paper with you. And Aldo, thank you, as ever, for all of your amazing organization of these events. It's a real testament to your enthusiasm and your energy for philosophy that you get us together, even in the midst of these difficult times, to do the important work of philosophy. Thank you ever so much. Really, really thank you.
Thank you. We come back in the afternoon, 2 p.m. for the second part of the event today. Thanks, Kelly. I will finish the transmission, but don't go away. Just wait a moment.
I'll wait here.
Bye-bye.